Okay, so 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the U.S. captures a significant portion, over half of what was the nation of Mexico in 1821. Uh, and this sets up the fights in the 1850s over the question of expansion. And the first issue is California. As I said in the previous podcast, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada are not big players in the story yet. There are very few folks there besides indigenous folks like the Mescalero Apache and the Navajo and that kind of thing. So California. So keep your focus on California. So what happens is that in 1849, 1848, 1849, there's a gold rush in California. Poor Mexico, right? Right at the time it loses California to the U.S., gold is discovered in California at Sutter's Mill. And you have this major gold rush. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold being mined in California right after the Mexican defeat in the Mexican-American War. But for our purposes, the significant thing is that California gains the 50,000 person threshold necessary to apply for statehood almost instantly, almost overnight, because of the gold rush. And there's a big fight in California. Would California be free or would California be slave? And if you look at the map, which I posted, the U.S. in 1850, or if you can visualize it, if you draw the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific, well, there's a significant portion of California, Los Angeles, San Diego, which is south of the Missouri Compromise line. But it was unclear if the Missouri Compromise line even extended to California. So you do have Southerners bringing in slaves into California immediately after 1848. But on the whole, the majority, by a large margin, of people who come into California after 1848 during the gold rush are anti-slavery. They do not want the system of slavery in California. Again, they're racist. They know not only do they not want slavery in California, they don't want African Americans in California, the majority of the Californians. So in 1850, when California applies for statehood, the territorial legislature meets, and when California applies for statehood, it applies for entry into the U.S. as a free state, as a state without slavery. Well, the South just goes nuts when this happens. They're very, very bitter. The South had very much been the engine of the Mexican-American War. The South feels betrayed. How could California be stolen from our very noses? And the admission of California into the Union created a huge stalemate in Congress and in a sectional crisis. And ultimately, a compromise was reached. And it took a long time to get there, and I'm not going to bore you with the facts, but here are the big details. And again, when you're thinking about this, and it's the road to the Civil War. I don't want to say the Civil War was inevitable. Historians don't like the word inevitable. It kind of puts us out of a job if everything's inevitable. But it does, when looking back on it, it's pretty clear that some kind of major crisis was going to happen at some point. So California, the Compromise of 1850, California comes into the Union as a free state, So that is a major loss for the Southern slaveholding interest. What does the South get in return? The big concession the South gets in return is the fugitive slave law is passed. Now, in the Constitution, it was guaranteed that slaves would be returned to their masters. The word slavery does not appear in the Constitution or slave. But I don't remember the exact language now, but the Constitution says something about property being returned. But it was in the Constitution, but it wasn't really enforced that strongly by the U.S. government. After 1850, the U.S. government, again, the U.S. presidency is dominated by Southerners or Northerners who have pro-Southern interests. Or let me put it a different way. In the 1850s, the Democratic Party dominates the presidency, and the Democratic Party is a very pro slavery party, especially the presidents of the United States. So you could be from the North, such as Franklin Pierce, who was president of the United States, and still be very much in favor of slavery because you're part of an alliance with Southern Democrats. So the big picture is the power of the federal government, the police power of the federal government is now put in service of returning runaway slaves. So it becomes much more tightly enforced. Now, there are other aspects of the Compromise of 1850. The slave trade is stopped in Washington, D.C., which is kind of interesting, I think. But the bigger issues for us is California comes in as a free state in the Fugitive Slave Act. Okay, now Northerners hate the Fugitive Slave Act. And when I'm talking about Northerners, I'm talking about, remember, the North is well over 95% white at this point. It's not a multicultural society at all. It's multicultural in the sense, I guess, you have Irish, German, that kind of a thing, but racially it's not. So Northerners who really don't care about slavery or willing to let slavery exist in the Southern states, they don't like being suddenly now the federal government coming into their towns searching for runaway slaves. The other thing is the statute, it allowed federal marshals to deputize local folks in order to help return runaway slaves. So suddenly now you got caught up in returning a runaway slave. And so suddenly now the coercive power of the US government is coming into your neighborhood. If there happens to be a runaway slave or someone suspected of being a runaway slave in your neighborhood. There are very famous cases where returned slaves are sent back to the South. The most famous one was Anthony Burns. He was a captive who had escaped. He was living in Boston. He was captured, and there were major protests in Boston. Now, Boston, to its credit, to its everlasting credit, was an abolitionist hotbed. There were major demonstrations in Boston. There were attempts to try to free him. So ultimately, the president of the US at this point, who I think was Pierce, he sends in the army to march Burns down the streets of Boston to a naval ship. So once again, you have the US government now. The US Army is transporting a runaway slave to a US naval ship to be returned to the South. Now, this didn't happen very much, but it became very symbolic of the new power of the federal government and the willingness of the federal government to use its power to return runaway slaves. As Burns marched through the streets of Boston, flags were hung upside down, buildings were draped in black. It was a very, very dramatic incident, but it didn't stop him, Burns, from being returned to slavery. So the Fugitive Slave Act, it helps inflame sectional tensions. Northerners don't really like being part of returning runaway slaves. That doesn't mean that they necessarily wanted to go to war to end slavery. We're not there yet for white Northerners, but it does increase the tensions. It allows Northerners or helps Northerners demonize Southern slaveholders. Not that Southern slaveholders shouldn't have been demonized. They were a pretty terrible bunch. And on the part of Southern slaveholders and Southerners in general, they're just furious at Northerners for being against the fugitive slave law. There were laws passed in several states that attempted to protect slaves from the Fugitive Slave Act from the federal government. And Southerners were just furious that Northerners would go along with these attempts to help runaway slaves. So what we're starting to see is just this gap growing between Northerners and Southerners. After the defeat of Mexico, the first big test case is California. California comes into the U.S. as a free state. because whites in California don't want to compete against slave labor, and they don't want African Americans in California, and the passage of a much stronger Fugitive Slave Act.